Let's go ahead and get started. I am Eureka Williams, and I'm an associate professor here at TCC's Metro campus. And I'd like to welcome you all to Afternoons of African American Awareness. This is how TCC kind of kicks off Black History Month. And this year, we are focusing on the Tulsa Race Massacre. We are so excited to begin our series this year with Professor Lansana from OSU Tulsa. And he's going to talk to us in just a minute. He's going to kind of frame this for us. To introduce him, we're going to have Tanya Crutcher, who's the treasurer of the TCC African American Student Association. Just a few things before we continue. Please note that these sessions are being recorded. Just want to keep that in mind. And mute yourself. There will be an opportunity towards the end of this to ask questions. But right now, we just want Tanya to introduce Professor Lansana, and then he will get started. Thank everybody, I thank all of y'all so much for joining us this afternoon. All right, Tanya.
Thank you, Dr. Williams, for that introduction. And I'm so glad to see everybody here with us this afternoon. First of all, let me make sure that you're able to hear my voice clearly. Okay, that's a good sign. Well, I am so excited to be able to just briefly introduce a phenomenal man. Professor Quraysh Ali Lansana is author of 20 books in poetry, nonfiction, and children's literature. He is currently a Tulsa Artist Fellow and serves as acting director of the Center for Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation at Oklahoma State University, Tulsa. He's also writer in residence for the Center for Poets and Writers and adjunct professor in African Studies and English. Lansana is creator and executive producer of KOSU NPR's Focus Black Oklahoma monthly radio program. A former faculty member of both the writing program of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and the drama division of the Juilliard School. He served as director of the Gwendolyn Brooks Center for Black Literature and Creative Writing at Chicago State University from 2002 to 2012, and was associate professor of English creative writing there until 2014. His work, Our Difficult Sunlight, A Guide to Poetry, Literacy, and Social Justice in Classroom and Community, was published in March 2011 by the Teachers and Writers Collaborative and was a 2012 NAACP Image Award nominee. His most recent books include The Skin of Dreams, New and Collected Poems, 1995 to 2018, The Whiskey of Our Discontent, Gwendolyn Brooks as Conscious and Change Agent, 2017, and The Breakbeat Poets, New American Poetry in the Age of Hip Hop, 2015. Lansana's work appears in Best American Poetry, 2019, and his forthcoming titles include Those Who Stayed, Life in 1921 Tulsa After the Massacre, and Opal's Greenwood Oasis. He is a founding member of Tri-City Collective. Please join me in offering a very warm welcome to Professor Quraysh Ali Lansana. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Ms. Tanya. I appreciate that. Good afternoon to everyone. And I want to take a moment. You brought up the NAACP Image Award. I'm going to share a little story, but I'm going to start this story by saying, Ashe, 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 Mama Cicely Tyson, we lost a giant. We lost a very, very profoundly impactful human and woman, and that she survived Miles Davis and went on to do really amazing things and just hold it down for so long. And so that brings to mind this story, and then we'll talk about what we're here to talk about. So when I was in Hollywood for the NAACP Image Awards that year, I was sitting on the end of a row, about 13 rows up from the stage, I had the pleasure of sitting next to the Red Tails, to the Tuskegee Airmen, those who were still alive, and we just lost one of those elders last week as well. I was sitting, also in front of me was John Carlos, who was one of the Olympians who raised his fist, and also someone with whom we share a publishing company, or publisher, I should say. And so there's some commotion on the stage. Diane Carroll is covering for something. Lou Gossett Jr. gets up, right? So it reminds you, right? I'm saying these names and I'm like, I'm sitting here and here comes Lou Gossett Jr., right? Rushing up the aisle. And, something's going on. I think we're maybe in a commercial break and folks are looking for someone and they can't find them. And so about 2 minutes later, Lou Gossett Jr. comes back down the aisle with Mama Cicely Tyson, right? So they rush her on the stage. And she says she does whatever she does on the stage. And then we're in a commercial break again. And she comes back and she's walking right beside me. And I'm like, oh my God, this is Cicely Tyson, right? And so I say, hi, Miss Tyson. Maybe probably hi, Mama Tyson. And she leans down to me and right in my face and says, hi, baby. And I thought I could die right now. I'm good. I'm good. So Ashe, Mama Cicely. She will be missed. So I'm going to begin with an excerpt from a poem from A.J. Smitherman. As you know, A.J. Smitherman was the founder and publisher of the Tulsa Star. Prior to the Tulsa Star, the Muskogee Star. Prior to that, he worked at the Muskogee Scimitar. And A.J. Smitherman is a hero of mine in terms of my studies and my history, my scholarship on Greenwood. And one of the things that maybe people don't know as much about Smitherman is that he was an attorney, and he was the lead attorney on most of the guardianship lawsuits that the white folks filed against Native Americans to get their land for oil. And that intersection is also compelling because the Osage murders, which was about killing indigenous folks for their land for oil, those murders started 2 months prior to the massacre. And so one of the fascinating places of intersection for me that I think is underexplored in this scholarship is that relationship, that connection between the Osage murders and the massacre. But A.J. Smitherman was very much in front in terms of defending Native American brothers and sisters who folks were coming after their land because of the oil. And so he's a very fascinating character in this history. But here's a poem that he wrote many poems, published really great op-ed pieces as well in his paper, which is why the mob came to get him, because they decided that he had incited the riot, incited the massacre. So here's an excerpt from a poem. If I could stand in the midst of the dead bodies of those brave Black men who fell in the Tulsa riot and massacre, as martyrs to the greatest cause it has ever been human privilege to espouse, I would lift my eyes in adoration and gratitude to the great God of the universe who gave use their being and my voice to their fellow man throughout this broad land. And on behalf of a grateful race, pay homage to their blessed memory. By way of eulogy, it may well be said that because of them, the hope of our race looms brighter and the world has been made some better. Not because they lived in it, but because they died as they did. True martyrs to a sacred cause, fighting against overwhelming odds and without hope of surviving the conflict. These men gave their all that a great principle might triumph. 'Tis better to fight and die if need be than to live if to live means to compromise manhood and to sacrifice the sacred things that life is made of. So that's from Eulogy to the Tulsa Martyrs by Smitherman. And wrote that in Buffalo, New York, safely, because he and the family had to flee because the mob had come and burned down the Tulsa Star, and they really they were trying to kill him. He was, as I mentioned, blamed for inciting the massacre because of his very, very strong pro-Black forceful poems and op-ed pieces in his newspaper. So one of the things I think that's important, at least to me, about Black Wall Street, about Greenwood, is how it evolved, right? And so I like to spend a time on its evolution and on the excellence, on the Black excellence that prospered for nearly 2 decades prior to the massacre. And so one of the things I think is important to note, right, is that where Greenwood resides, where OSU Tulsa exists, right, is a convergence of Osage, Creek, and Cherokee land, right? And so there are many debates. If you talk to our Muskogee Creek family, they'll say this was our land. How did Black folks get it? If you talk to the Cherokee folks, they say, no, this was our land first. How did these Black folks get it? What we do know is that there was a combination of freedmen from the Creek and the Cherokee, and then that land sort of lay dormant for a little while. And then O.W. Gurley, who himself was a very wealthy man, his family he actually participating in the land run, and that's something else that's underexplored in the state's history, that Black folks actually participated in the land run. And so Gurley and his family did. And staked a claim near Guthrie, and that's where they discovered oil on their land. So O.W. Gurley was a very wealthy man already when he moved to Tulsa and opened that first business right at 101 North Greenwood, and then helped many other folks open up their businesses in the district by loaning money, by taking care of one another. And you think about it, right? We know, I lived in Chicago for 29 years. On the south side of Chicago, there's a Chinatown. In LA, there's a Chinatown. And, in most major cities, New York, I lived there a while, there's a Chinatown. There's a little Italy or Italian village on the west side of Chicago. And one of the things about those communities, those ethnic communities, right, is that they took care of themselves, and they took care of folks who wanted to come in from China, right? And then banks loaned them money to set up businesses, and they kept their monies in their village, in their community. And they the dollars exchanged hands with hands that all look the same, right? Of the same ethnicity. And and Greenwood was that. And when you think about it, right, there are a few places like that. In terms of the Black American experience, a handful. But what distinguishes Greenwood from Harlem, from the Hill District in Pittsburgh, from Black Bottom in Detroit, even from Bronzeville, in Chicago, where I lived, is that Black folks in Greenwood owned their land and owned their property, right? And folks in Harlem, some Black folks owned in Harlem, but most rented, most leased. The Black folks in Chicago owned many of their businesses and whatnot, but Greenwood not only precedes those cities, and with the exception of Chicago, precedes these cities in terms of its history, its evolution, but also its wealth, right? And I think that's something that should not and cannot be ignored as well. So backing up again. So you all likely know that the first Black folks got to what was then Indian territory via the 5 tribes. I refuse to call them civilized, because that word civilized was based on if you owned Africans as property. That's what that means, if you didn't know. So the Chickasha, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, the Creek, and the Seminole, that's how we got here, via the Trail of Tears. That's how the first Black folks got here before the boostering happened, which we will talk about a little bit later. And we were either freedmen, we were either property, freedmen, or intermarried. But we were we were tribal citizens. And that's via the Trail of Tears, via the Long Walk, is how Black folks got here. And then after the Civil War, the passage of the 13th Amendment, the federal government allotted land grants to the nations, to the tribes, right? who were divided, right, about the war, right? The Creeks and the Seminoles supported the Union, the Choctaw and the Chickasha fought on behalf of the Confederacy, and the Cherokee didn't know what to do. They didn't know which side to fight for, so they ended up having an internal conflict throughout the war and did not really engage in any significant numbers, in the Civil War. But after the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment, when the federal government allotted land grants to members of these five nations, that meant Black folks who were members of those five nations also received land grants. And so, that 40 acres and a mule sort of comment or idea sort of bears true here, although sometimes those allotments were as many as 100 acres. And so Black folks got together and owned land, right? And we know that at about this time, right, 1850, Tallahassee, Oklahoma was the first all Black town, the first Black town, right? And that's 1850, that's pre-Civil War, right? But then post-Civil War, you have almost 100 all Black towns in this state, right? More than any other place in the country. And a large part of that is because of these land allotments, these land grants from the Civil War. Black folks now own property, could build on their property, could graze cattle, and grow crops, and were independent, and of this independent spirit in nature, which is a part of what drove folks or motivated folks to migrate to Oklahoma. That this idea that this was a sort of a Black Mecca, that a Black person could become independently successful without out from under the yoke of the Jim Crow of the Deep South, right? But not quite, right? But segregation was still, right? Deep segregation, right? And extreme racism was still the fashion of the times, right? And what you have happening, right, is this oil boom, this Texas tea, right, making Tulsa, Oklahoma, a very, very wealthy and prosperous city. While at the same time, you have Black folks building towns, building cities, owning their lands, right, owning their own land and property, and not allowed at all to engage in the oil business unless you were an O.W. Gurley and you owned property and you had oil on your property. But Black folks weren't allowed to work the oil fields, weren't engaged in any of that industry in the early years of Tulsa, and it may still be in some ways that way now, but certainly in the early years of Tulsa, that was the legislated case, right? And so O.W. Gurley in 1905, right? So we're still pre-statehood. In 1905, buys the grocery store and one room, or builds, I should say, a grocery store and a one-story rooming house right at 101 North Greenwood, and that was the catalyst for the district, right? And then other folks start to hear about this and start to move in, and then you've got John and Louisa Williams with the confectionery and the Dreamland Theater. J.B. Mann comes in and borrows money from O.W. Gurley and builds his grocery store. J.B. Stratford comes and borrows money from O.W. Gurley and builds his hotels and other businesses. And now you have, again, this exchange. There's a great sort of story or adage, right, that $1 could start at Greenwood and Archer at sunrise, travel all the way up Greenwood to Pine and back at sunset. And that $1 would have been exchanged by nothing but Black hands for that entire day, right? And it's interesting to think about that again in context of what are we doing now, right? How can we, what are the ways in which we can get back to that kind of thinking, that kind of economic and community mindset? I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I often ask folks, right, who benefited most from integration? We know the answer to who benefited most from integration, and it wasn't us, right? But even that as a thought, and I'm going to get back to integration in a minute because we're still in early Greenwood, but that notion, right, that there was a time when we kept our money in the community and we took care of the community and we took care of our own. And it was safe, and prosperous, wealthy. And the over, in my mind, the sort of the overarching the overarching narrative, often when we think about, or when we're taught about, if we are taught about it at all, Greenwood, Tulsa, is just the massacre and not the great wealth and the vibrant community that preceded it. And that's not to say that the massacre wasn't the most significant early acts of racial violence in the history of this country. It was the first non-wartime bombing on US soil. But we don't spend much time thinking about the district that thrived and was safe and was economically just vital to, and folks from around the world took note of Tulsa, Oklahoma, specifically of Greenwood, because of that economic independence and because of that money. Simon Berry, one of the early business founders, inhabitants of Greenwood, great story. Moved in from Tennessee with his wife, and Simon Berry was good with autos, with mechanic work, and so he started working on folks' cars, helping folks with cars. Done enough business that he actually opened up an auto mechanic shop, and was very good at that. So then he decided he would take some of the profits from the auto mechanic business and open up a bus line. So he started the first bus line in Tulsa, not just the first Black bus line, the first bus line service in Tulsa, right? And the bus would travel Greenwood Avenue from Greenwood and Archer all the way up to Pine, the further north being the more residential part of the district, and back, and picking up folks who wanted to come to Deep Greenwood, which is the Greenwood Archer area, to shop, to party, to do business, and then on to Second Street for the folks who were domestics or laborers who worked in South Tulsa, who worked in white people's homes. First and Second Street was as far as Blacks could go in Tulsa, as far south, I should say, that Blacks could go in Tulsa without a white escort. And that will circle around, that'll circle back in a way when we start talking about internment. But yeah, so Simon Berry built this bus line, ran it for several years, and then the city came to him, approached him, and said, "We'd like to buy your bus line." And Simon Berry said, "Okay, I will sell you my bus line on two conditions. One, that my Black drivers will get to keep their jobs and continue to drive this line on this route, and two, that my Black riders will get to continue to ride the buses." And the city said, "Okay," and he sold his bus line. And then he also had a route that went east-west to Sapulpa, and Meadowlark Lemon of the Harlem Globetrotters from Sapulpa used to ride that bus from the east-west from Sapulpa, again, to Deep Greenwood, to Greenwood and Archer, because that's where the action was, yo. There were clubs, juke joints, jazz, blues halls, and then stores and business, and that's where you wanted to be. Greenwood was where you wanted to be. So after Simon Berry sold his bus line to the city, he decided, and he collaborated with a friend named Northam to create a charter plane service. So at the time of the massacre, right, Simon Berry had 6, and his partner had 6 charter planes. And they would fly oil barons to their lots around Oklahoma or Texas or what have you, and fly them back, right? Black men flying these white oil barons but Simon Berry had a charter plane service, right? Where's that entrepreneurial spirit? I know it exists in our DNA. We got to tap into it. And in many ways we do, but we need to, I think we could do more. But Simon Berry, in today's dollars, when he died, Simon Berry in today's money would have been worth $2 million annually, right? Annually. And so just to give you a sense of what kind of wealth. And that's only one of the business barons, if you will, or founders of Black Wall Street. He singularly was worth $2 million a year, right? That is, and today where are our $2 million a year folks? But sports, music, entertainment, every now and again some business. Certainly not in higher ed, y'all. but just think about that. 2 million annually, and he was just one of many. You got, Gurley and Stratford and Mann, and all of them just making money hand over fist and keeping it in the community because they had to, right? Because they could not go to South Tulsa and shop, right? And so we had to take care of ourselves, right? In the kids' book that I just co-authored that just came out this past week, right? We have a line, it's called Opal's Greenwood Oasis. And we have a line, Opal's an 8-year-old girl child, right? Who's growing up pre-massacre in Greenwood. And there's a line in the book we wrote that in Greenwood, we have everything we need. And it might surprise you to know that everyone looks like me. And we have everything that we need because we had to. We had to have everything that we need to be able to live, to be able to eat, to be able to purchase a home, because we could not do that much business in South Tulsa with White Tulsa. It was the legislated law of land was segregation, right? I mean, the history of this state, right? So when the founders of the state petitioned, went to DC to meet with then President Teddy Roosevelt about establishing this territory as a state, Teddy Roosevelt was fine with it as long as it wasn't a Jim Crow state. He was not supportive of that. So they went back and put their paperwork together. And by the time they get their paperwork together, Cleveland was president. And they submitted their paperwork without any hint of Jim Crow. Cleveland granted statehood. And then the very first piece of legislation in the history of the state of Oklahoma, Senate Bill number 1, not only makes Oklahoma a Jim Crow state, but makes Oklahoma the Jim Crow laws maybe the harshest in the country. The coach laws, they were transportation laws, is how they sort of the sleight of hand, right? And you think about it, right? That is in defiance of the federal government, and Oklahoma has really been governed that way ever since. When you think about it, right? In defiance of the federal government. But that's how committed the founding white men of Oklahoma were in tarnishing or controlling or tainting our power. And so they did that. So statehood was granted in 1907. And then there are the rumblings of war. And so there cannot be, it cannot be sort of understated again that Oklahoma, one of the youngest states in the Union, trying to decide, govern more like a deep Southern state than anything else, right? And that deep legislated racism and segregation on the books statewide. And then you have the rumblings of World War I, right? And World War I, almost 3 million men fought in World War I, including more than 350,000 Black men. And this was the first time we were able to serve in the military, but worked in segregated units, could not carry guns, mostly cooks and those sorts of things, but, we're not allowed to carry guns. But this was the first time that Black folks were able to serve in the military. And at the time that World War I was starting, and you've got, again, 3 million men went off to Europe to fight. That's a lot of people, right? And a lot died, right? Many died. But that's 3 million men from all over the country which means what? Which means that as the second industrial revolution was happening, you've got a lot of factories without employees. So thus the migration, right? The first of the two great migrations north, to replace or take these jobs that were now empty or left vacant by the white men, largely white men who had gone off to war, right? And so that's what spurred, papers like the Chicago Defender and others saying, come, we need you. Come to Chicago, come to Philadelphia, come to New York, work in these factories. And it gave great anxiety to the white folks who were in these northern cities, right? Because they had to work beside them. They had to shelter beside them. They felt like their jobs and their safety were at risk. And then again, this very, very deep systemic racism, right? And then the war ended again. And as the twisted irony of this being that we're in the midst of a pandemic now, and at the end of that war, we dealt with the Spanish flu, right? Which the pandemic we are in currently is probably can only compare to the Spanish influenza of that day, right? In terms of the scope, the magnitude, the number of people who have had COVID, who have COVID, and who have died from it. But anyway, so then the war ends 1918. And with this, again, with the exodus of 3 million men, over 2 million, almost 3 million of them white men going off to war, and then the migration happening to encourage Black folks to come and take these jobs, come and work in these factories, began the efforts to unionize these Black workers, right? So you have at the same time, so it's almost it's a perfect storm in many ways, because you have then the efforts, and socialism is entering the country in a way that is starting to alarm people, the more conservative people. The idea of unionizing Black workers with white workers in these particular industries was making the government nervous, making other people nervous, and so what starts to happen, right, is the white men come home, all the men come home from the war, and the white men want their jobs back and get them by and large, but now there are Black folks here, and they're my neighbors, and they work next to me, and that's not how I left. If I survived the war, that wasn't my reality when I left. Why is it my reality now? And so white veterans started to attack Black veterans. Red Summer was largely started by white veterans who felt like the Black men who fought overseas had gotten too uppity. They went over to France and got a taste of freedom and independence, and they came back and they weren't going to honor Jim Crow. They weren't going to be subservient to white men. And so Red Summer was born with white veterans killing Black veterans. That's how it began. It cycled and escalated from that to include just Blacks and Jewish folks as well. But primarily, it was about white veterans killing Black veterans, who they felt like had gotten too uppity for Jim Crow, right? And so this is when lynchings began, right? When lynchings were really, really rampant, right? So just in that period, right, 25 riots, 97 known lynchings, right? And the massacre of 200 Black folks in Elaine, Arkansas, 6 hours from here, right, occurred between April and November of 1919. The war ended in 1918. So in 1 year, right, 25 riots, 97 known lynchings, and 200 Black folks killed in Elaine, Arkansas. It's actually conceivable, right? Because that's 1919. That's 2 years before the massacre here. It's very possible, it's been hard to track down, but very possible that white men who participated in the Elaine, Arkansas massacre moved to Tulsa, because if you were in this region of the world, Tulsa was where you wanted to be if you were white, because there was oil. There was jobs to be had. You could come and try and, stake a claim and become the next Beverly Hillbilly for my elders in the crew who know what I'm talking about, right? So it's conceivable that there are some white men who actually participated in both massacres. Just think about that for a second. 2 years separate, 2 years and 6 hours separating Lane, Arkansas and Tulsa, right? So this was Red Summer. This is what this became to be known as Red Summer, right? Brutal assaults initiated generally by white soldiers upon black veterans, with help from a very reinvigorated KKK. And then in their victims included both the white veterans, the black veterans, as well as their wives, as women and children, right? And Tulsa itself was a buzz, an enclave for the Klan, right? The city was run by the Klan. I mean, as in, and I'm not being like facetious or cute, right? The city officials were Klan members, right? And for that matter, most of the governors during this period, the governors of Oklahoma, were Klan members as well, right? And hell, they might still run the state now. I mean, some of the decisions that we've seen coming out of Oklahoma City are baffling to me. So it's a toss-up from where I sit, y'all. I'm just, it's a toss-up. But the Klan had such a hub here, and in every facet of civic life. And so this is the national climate, right? And Oklahoma, of course, is a part of the nation. So the Red Summer scare, the buzz, the end of the war, the Red Summer, and there were men from Oklahoma, obviously, who went off to war, black and white. The scare of unionizations, and again, in the period in which even white Oklahomans went off to war, they came back, and there were more black people here than there were before they left. Why? Because you've got Edwin McCabe and others who are doing this boostering, right? Recruiting black folks to Oklahoma, right? While like I said, the great migrations to the larger northern cities was also happening. There was recruiting happening to move to Oklahoma as well. Again, with this idea of it being a black mecca of independence, of wealth. You can own your own property. You can be your own person in Oklahoma. And so that is the national stage. That is the temperature of the country. When 19-year-old Dick Rowland rolls into the Ingersoll Recreation Center at 3rd and Main to go to work on Memorial Day, right? And the owner of Ingersoll had arranged for his black employees, his black shoe shiners, to use the bathroom on the top floor of the Drexel Hotel across the street, right? And the elevator operators at that time were usually white women, young white women, and 17-year-old Sarah Page ran that elevator. And here's a quote from his auntie, Auntie Damie Rowland Ford. I mean, she wasn't his biological auntie. She adopted him. He was an orphan. On Monday noon, the 30th of May, he came running home breathless and said that the police were after him for what had just occurred. He had just delivered some shoes upon the 3rd floor of the Drexel building to a customer, had used the restroom, and when leaving, he got into Sarah Page's elevator to go down. But she hadn't gotten the elevator even with the floor, so he tripped and stepped on her instep. She was so mad at him for stepping on her sore foot that she pounded him again and again on the top of his head with her leather purse, vigorous enough to break off its handles. He said, as in Dick, I reached up to hold her arms back and prevent her from pounding my head and held them there. When the elevator reached the ground floor lobby, Sarah screamed, I've been assaulted. When a clerk from the nearby Renberg Clothers, which was next to the elevator shaft, tried to approach or to apprehend Rowland, he fled. I outran him and fled here, Rowland said to Aunt Damie in her home. I've got to hide until tomorrow. Right. So, and Dick was arrested the next day. There's some things to know about this story. One is that many historians, including myself, have uncovered reasons to believe that Sarah and Dick were not strangers, were not just acquaintances, work acquaintances, that they actually were involved with one another. That Sarah often hung out in Deep Greenwood at the juke joints with Dick. We do know that they moved to Kansas City together after the massacre, and then to the West Coast. So they were they were acquainted with one another. Sarah had been married already. Again, it wasn't too uncommon back in the day for to be so young, to be 17 and had already been married. It's certainly uncommon now, but she'd already been married. She had what many folks call a questionable reputation, in part maybe because she was no longer married, but and probably in part because she hung out with Black folks, because she would hang out in the district. So it's an interesting thing to consider, and many historians that I know and have read sort of debate on this, right? That if she actually screamed and if it was a joke or if it was serious, it didn't matter. Because in 1921 Tulsa, Oklahoma, right, a white woman screams, a Black man's in the vicinity, someone is dying, and it won't be the white woman, right? So Dick ran home, ran to his Auntie Damie's house, and he was arrested and jailed the next day because he decided he couldn't stay in the house anymore. So he went out, and when he went out, he got arrested, and he actually was arrested by the two of the Black deputy sheriffs in the district. Excuse me. And then the Tulsa Tribune, right, that same day, the day that he was arrested, carried a headline on the front page that read, "Nabbed Negro for attacking girl in elevator." And the Tribune, also published an editorial with the headline, "To Lynch Negro Tonight." Right? Though that editorial was pulled from the paper before the print run was completed. But there were some parts of the city who got that paper that said "To Lynch Negro Tonight." And there's nothing subtle about that, right? There's nothing subtle here, right? Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator, to lynch Negro tonight. The intentions are clear, right? There's nothing subtle there. And one of the interesting things, and I see one of my boss ladies, Nikki Reagan Neely, on the call, so she knows that I talk about this quite often. That one of the things about OSU Tulsa and the land on which it resides, and part of the work that Miss Nikki and I and others, and hopefully you all will help us engage in, right, is repairing the relationship that the district has, that the university has with the district. And in part of that is because one of the Tulsa Tribune heirs ran OSU Tulsa for over a decade. So think about that. So if you think about how OSU Tulsa, again, I've only been here 2.5 years. So, but just from what I understand, OSU Tulsa's sort of lack of engagement until Dr. Fry came on board as president could be directly connected to the fact that Howard Barnett is from the Tulsa Tribune family, right? From that family. So anyway, I know I've gotten very, we're almost out of time here. But I want to make sure that you understand that, that when, a white mob came to get, Dick was arrested, put in the jail for his own protection. A white mob gathered, wanted to take him out. Black men then gathered, then the crowd was dispersed. And then a white mob returned, even larger. Then a small group of Black men went back to the jail, and a white man and a Black veteran who had an Army issued gun, who wasn't supposed to have an Army issued gun, but some Blacks were allowed to engage with guns later on in World War I, but very few. But he had an Army issued gun, and the white veteran said, "Where you get that gun, boy? You're not supposed to have that gun." He said, "This is my gun." They wrestled over the gun. The shot went off, and then it was on. And that's how it started. And then think about 36 blocks of homes, businesses, schools, churches, all gone. Right? White mobs stopping the firemen from trying to put out burning homes of Black people, shooting at the firemen so the house would burn. That happened on numerous occasions, right? We have the dig for the mass graves is in progress. Most of us believe that there are over 300 losses of life. In the massacre, what the Tribune and the city government put out there was that there were about 33. It's really probably more like 300 is what we estimate. It should know that the sheriff at the time deputized 200, Sheriff Willard McCullough deputized 200 white men, and with the idea of don't harm anyone, just make sure they don't harm one another. And these deputized mobs went out and killed Black people. Well, I'll just leave you with this because I know that Dr. Williams wants to leave some time for question. That as where the centennial is just months away, and I just want us to remember again that what Black folks built, right? That kind of entrepreneurial spirit, that kind of independent thought, is in our DNA. And that as we observe the centennial of the massacre, that we also take time to observe what the district was, right, before it was destroyed, and how vital, important, and vibrant it really, really was, and can be again. The district was rebuilt 3 times, right? 1941 was the height, other than prior to 1921, was the height of its economic vitality. But Greenwood was rebuilt in 1922, and then after what Jane Baldwin calls Negro removal, and then this reawakening that I believe is happening now. So I will stop there, Dr. Williams.
All right, thank you so much. I don't see any questions in the chat yet, and Dr. Adwasi is going to monitor those, but does anyone have a question right now for Professor Lansana? There's a lot of good information there. Anybody have any? I mean, I have some stuff that I've jotted down, but
I have a question actually.
Sure.
The revelation of the relationship between Dick and Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
First time I've heard that ever in all the years that I've researched the Gap. You said that there is some evidence that they went off together after the massacre happened.
Right, that's correct.
California and everything like that.
Kansas City first, then Cali. Yeah.
Kansas City to Cali. So did they essentially stay together for the rest of their lives and have children and things of that nature?
Nothing that I've discovered suggests that they stayed together. But they did end up in California after some time in Kansas City together.
And it's soon after the massacre itself.
Yeah, they fled to Kansas City pretty soon after the massacre, right?
So he was still in jail when everything went down. He was still in the jail.
He was moved. He was Sheriff McCullough actually got him out of the jail. They snuck past some railroad tracks, and he was able to get out and get away. So he survived. Many others didn't, but Dick actually did live.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's a good question.
So there's a question in the chat. What happened to Sarah's family, and have they ever come out and spoken publicly about the massacre?
Well, Sarah, I think it's a good question too. So Sarah and her family wanted her to file charges. So she did file charges. And then shortly after, maybe a week or so after, she dropped the charges and confessed. So, and then she fled off with Dick, or caught up with Dick. There's a thought in my head that I'm missing right now. What was it? Oh, here it is. So when there was thought that there was going to be a court case, Auntie Damie Rowland, Dick's auntie, needed to lawyer up. So she went and got Hudson, from Hudson Lake is named, right? A noted Klan member, and to be the attorney to defend Dick should this thing go to court. And that's another fascinating moment in history to think about. Did she first try some Black attorneys? Were all the Black attorneys dead or gone, right? Could she have gotten one from Oklahoma City if she had the means? But she chose, for whatever reason, she chose a known Klan member to defend Dick should that go to trial. And it might have just been smart strategery, but it didn't go to trial. Sarah dropped the charges.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I recently had a conversation with someone who believes that the spirit of Greenwood, the entrepreneurial spirit of Greenwood, is more of an ideology as opposed to a physical location. And because of the pushback from the city and the challenges with the Greenwood Chamber of Commerce, this person believes that we could actually, in other words, the location could be moved someplace else farther north, but rather than the historic Greenwood location. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a great question, and you're going to drag me into some politics, Tanya. You know you're doing that, right? But you knew that when you asked the question, fam. Yeah. Well, first of all, Greenwood was 36 blocks, right? So it's not just the 100 block of, from Archer to the highway, right? Or to OSU. Greenwood was 36 blocks all the way to Pine, as far west as Detroit, as far east as, what's the street? Starts with the L, can't remember now. But it's huge, right? And so I absolutely positively agree that we should be investing as much time and energy in what's north of the highway than what's south of the highway, for sure. And I have my own issues with a BMX park over there. I have issues. I was in Tulsa conducting research for probably part of this talk I'm giving you now, and walked out of my hotel room. This was several years ago. Walked out of my hotel room and looked at the front page of the paper and saw that banner headline said, "New driller site found, Greenwood." And I almost lost my brain, right? I was like, what? Why? What is this? So yes, the district is larger than at 101, than the 100 block. And I believe that we need to put some time and energy investment into the district north of the highway, and even streets other than Greenwood. But we could start on Greenwood for sure, And again, I've been in Tulsa for 2.5 years, and I have been saddened and frustrated and disappointed in the petty warring that happens and infighting that occurs between these chambers of commerce, and that you know, I would love to be in a position at some point. I just talked about this with someone, to be able to mediate find some sort of truce so we can all move forward. But I just don't know. The sides may be too entrenched, Tanya. I don't know. But I know that, well, I'm not going to say that. What I will say is there's work to be done. And in the process of trying to get that work done, a lot of petty, conniving, money-driven nothingness. I'm watching my language here. Nothingness is happening or not happening, and it's really frustrating, and it's really disappointing. And I think that the Centennial Commission could be doing some things differently. But I know a lot of those folks, and I think some of the stuff they're doing is great, and some of the ways in which they're going about it, I disagree with strongly. But I'm going to stop there, Tanya, and if you want to talk privately, we can go there.
Dr.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Dr. Adwasi, we do have a question in the chat.
Okay.
If we can get that answered, and then maybe one more, and then we'll wrap up. So probably just 2 more questions.
Okay. So is there any written evidence about the connection between Banette and Tulsa Tribune?
Well, Barnett is an heir from the Tulsa Tribune family. They owned the Tribune. He's an heir to that family that owned the Tribune. So there's a direct bloodline. Yeah, direct DNA.
And the last one here is the conversation between Dick and his aunt recorded in writing for public view?
I'm sorry, would you repeat that, Brad?
The conversation between Dick and his aunt, is it recorded in writing?
It's in writing. It's in the Red Cross book. It's the big book, the Red Cross relief book on the massacre. Yeah, so you can definitely find it.
Okay, let's see. Are there any other kind of burning questions while we still have? Okay, I see it. Okay, go ahead.
I had a question about the rebuilding. So I was just wondering, is the Tulsa, what did you call it? The newspaper? What's
the Tulsa Tribune? No,
not the Tribune.
The Star.
The Star, yeah. Did it ever revive? Did Smith ever never come back to Tulsa?
He never returned to Tulsa. He fled to Buffalo, and he started the Buffalo Star, where he published that newspaper, worked on a biography for a while, but never returned to Tulsa. His great-granddaughter and I talk fairly regularly, working on a project together. She was just here a couple of weeks ago. But Smitherman, no, he was afraid for his life. He never came back to the state.
Oh, that's sad. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, go ahead. You had a question, G7 Media?
Yes, I did. You stated, and the main thing you stated that just made me about jump out of my seat was the prior to that deadly day. Mm-hmm. The buildup of 20 years before that day. You gave examples of some of the people there and everything like that. I'm originally from Oklahoma, just moving back from Atlanta after 20 years. And the main thing that I appreciate is how you gave the example of Greenwood down to Pine, how they would keep the money in and everything like that, which isn't tapped into. So my question is there, again, written evidence of the growth during that 20-year period, where it shows where basically it was at the height when it was taken down, but is there an example of the growth and the exchange, not only within the Black community, but some of the exchange that was happening with the Indigenous community and the Hispanic community?
Mostly in records that you can find at places like the Oklahoma History Center, the Tulsa Historical Society, because you have to remember, fam, that all that stuff was destroyed, right? The actual records, bank notes and, contracts and all of that stuff. I mean, one of the things that it is just a conundrum to me, I think about often, is that as a writer, as an author, as a creative, right? How there had to have been musicians in the district. There had to have been visual artists in the district, sculptors in the district, right? And all of that stuff was destroyed, right? So it's really, we have to look to places like the Smithsonian, excuse me, the History Center, the Historical Society, Tulsa Chamber, the courthouse for records, because they were destroyed. You know, we have very little to go on in terms of any artifacts that we can access that survived the massacre, sadly.
All right. Just keep.
Any other questions?
I'm trying not to.
Yeah, you just, I don't know. I thought I was challenged with technology, but you have won, sis.
No, don't say that about me.
Yeah.
Ramona, if you're still on here, do you want to talk about tonight?
Yes, I'm still here. I sent that to others if you want to know about a forum that's going on, kind of to continue this conversation. It's about white rage. And so if any of you want to link in to that conversation, you do have to register. So I put the link to register in there. Starts at 7:00 tonight. I'm looking forward to that. That's about all I know. I was sent that information, and I thought in this conversation, seems like it would be great if you wanted to dig a little deeper in this discussion.
All right. Thanks so much.
Uh-huh.
All right, everybody. It's after 1:00, so I'll go ahead and wrap up here. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us, Professor Lansana. You have really kicked off this series for us. All of our speakers this February will deal with the massacre. I mean, it continues next week, every one of them this year. We are really excited for the program that we've lined up. We hope that this is just the first one that you'll attend. But anyway, thanks so much for attending, and spread the word, so we can get more folks on here, and have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Well, I'll end it.